the vast majority of countries on Earth voted at the United Nations General Assembly to admit Palestine as a full member. However, the US and Israel and 7 small countries opposed the will of the vast majority of the international community, and even though the US and its allies only represent 5% of the world population, they are opposing the rest of the world and preventing Palestine from becoming a full member of the United Nations. In April, there was a vote in the UN Security Council on a resolution that would have admitted Palestine as a full member, and the US has veto power on the Security Council, so the US prevented that resolution from passing and therefore blocked Palestine from being recognized as a full member. In response to that, the UN General Assembly, where all countries have a vote, all member states, there are 193 member states in the world, on the 10th of May, the General Assembly held a vote on another resolution that called to admit Palestine as a full member, and 143 countries representing the vast majority of the global population voted in support of the resolution, which includes the most populous countries on Earth: China, India, Brazil, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Russia, Indonesia, Nigeria. These massive countries with huge populations voted to recognize Palestine, and only 9 countries voted against the resolution, opposing full membership for Palestine. Those were the United States, Argentina, which has a far-right pro-US government led by Javier Milei, who is a libertarian. Also Hungary, which has a right-wing anti-Muslim government. And Czechia, also known as the Czech Republic. And also Papua New Guinea. They voted against membership for Palestine, along with 3 tiny island nations. I made a list of the 9 countries that voted against the resolution and showed their populations. Together, they have a combined population of 429 million, which is 5% of the world population. Again, this includes the US, Argentina, Czechia, Papua New Guinea, Hungary, Israel, Micronesia, Palau, and Nauru. And I should point out that the tiny island nations of Micronesia, Palau, and Nauru have a combined population of just over 130,000 people. Palau has 22,000 people. Nauru has 10,000 people. They are smaller than small towns in major countries. So, I mean, really, it's the US and a small handful of puppets and allies that voted against statehood for Palestine. Now, what's also interesting about this vote is that many countries in Europe that are Western allies voted in support of recognizing Palestine, including France, Spain, and Portugal. And some other major European countries abstained, including the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. They abstained. And also, it's very noteworthy that Ukraine abstained. Ukraine is a close ally of Israel, supporting Israel's oppression of the Palestinians, supporting Israel's war on the Palestinian civilian population. And Ukraine has been very hostile against the global South, which represents the global majority, which is why it's very ironic that Western pundits constantly complain that the global South have not supported Ukraine. 87% of the population of the global South has not joined the West in supporting Ukraine. And yet it's no surprise when you see that Ukraine opposes the global South and Ukraine does not recognize the sovereignty of the Palestinian people. So why would the global South support Ukraine? In fact, back in November, there was another vote in the UN General Assembly condemning the illegal US blockade against Cuba, which has gone on for over 60 years. And almost every single country on Earth, 187 out of 193 UN member states, voted in support of the resolution calling to end the illegal US blockade against Cuba. And only 1 country abstained, Ukraine, and only 1 country joined the US in voting against the resolution, Israel. So we see how the US, Israel, and Ukraine are allied against the global South, against the global majority, and yet they constantly complain that the global majority does not support them. So if we go back to this map that I made that shows the vote on the 10th of May, you can see that the vast majority of countries in the global South, in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, voted to admit Palestine as a full member. And even some Western allies also joined, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. It shows how the US is really isolated on the world stage. And even more ironically, the US government is currently run by Joe Biden from the Democratic Party. And Biden has criticized Hungary's right-wing leader, Viktor Orbán, referring to him as a dictator. But Biden is allied with Viktor Orbán against Palestine in support of the Israeli apartheid regime. The Democrats condemn Hungary for being an ally of Donald Trump and the Republicans, and yet they're all in agreement in denying the Palestinian people their sovereignty and supporting Israeli colonialism. And before me here, I have the General Assembly resolution that was introduced on the 9th of May. And if you look at the countries that co-sponsor the resolution, you can see that they are global South nations representing Latin America, Africa, and West Asia. And by the way, it includes the leftist governments in Latin America, in Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And by the way, a quick note for people who might be confused why Venezuela co-sponsored the resolution, but why Venezuela did not vote in the General Assembly. It's because Venezuela's right to vote has been taken away from it because of the illegal US sanctions on Venezuela. The US stole Venezuela's assets that were held in its foreign bank accounts as part of the coup attempt launched by the Donald Trump administration in 2019 that Joe Biden has continued, this bipartisan coup attempt. So the US stole Venezuela's money, and Venezuela has not been able to pay its membership dues at the UN. So the UN suspended Venezuela's voting rights because of this. The UN also suspended Afghanistan's voting rights because the US also stole the foreign exchange reserves of Afghanistan. So here we see that the US is acting as a pirate, stealing the money of Venezuela, Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, and other countries. And this means that some of them have lost their voting rights at the UN. But Venezuela would have 100% voted in support of Palestine. Again, Venezuela co-sponsored the resolution. And this resolution, it should not be very controversial. What it says is that it, quote, determines that the state of Palestine is qualified for membership in the United Nations and should therefore be admitted to membership in the United Nations. It calls for the participation of the state of Palestine in the sessions and work of the General Assembly and the international conferences convened by the UN General Assembly. It reaffirms the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, their right to an independent state, and it calls for an end to the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 and which violates international law. So the countries that voted against this resolution are voting against recognizing the self-determination and sovereignty of the Palestinian people and are voting in support of Israel's illegal military occupation. And this exposes the hypocrisy of the US government, which for decades has claimed that it supposedly supports a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine. Joe Biden has said this repeatedly. As recently as October, he said, we cannot give up on a two-state solution. And he said he had a conversation with Netanyahu in which he talked about having a two-state solution. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said dozens of times that Washington supposedly supports a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine, and yet when it actually comes to votes on the international stage, the US always opposes the creation of a Palestinian state. the admission of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. And the US showed this, the Biden administration showed this back in April when it vetoed the Security Council resolution that would have admitted Palestine as a full member. This is why I always emphasize that it doesn't matter what the US government says. The rhetoric of the US government doesn't matter. Rhetoric is cheap. Actions are what matter. And objectively speaking, the Biden administration is allied with the far right in the US. The Democrats warned that Trump and the Republicans are fascist and extreme authoritarians, and yet they are allied with them. They are allied with the far right in Europe. They are allied with Viktor Orbán in Hungary. In fact, a poll published this May by the new media outlet Zeteo found that the majority of Democrats say that Israel is committing the G crime, the worst possible crime in Gaza. I'm not saying that word because then this will be censored in the algorithm. The majority of Democrats say that, and yet Biden is allied with the Republicans. The majority of Republicans say Israel is not committing the G crime. So once again, we see how the US government is not actually democratic. The Biden administration is not representing its own base. It's going against its own base and instead allying with the far right. And the US is opposing the will of the vast majority of humanity. 143 out of the 193 UN member states already recognize Palestine as a state and have formal diplomatic relations with Palestine. That is the vast majority of the global population. And if you look at a map, like I have right here, you can see that it is almost all of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It is only the West, led by the US, that refuses to officially recognize Palestine as a state. And now that this new resolution has passed in the General Assembly, what this means is that basically Palestine has all of the rights of other UN member states except it cannot vote. And I'm reading here from the UN News Agency, and it notes on the 10th of May when this resolution was passed, it notes that this resolution upgrades Palestine's rights at the world's body as an observer state without offering full membership. What it means is that now Palestine has all rights except it does not have the right to vote and does not have the right to put forward Palestinian candidates to official organs at the UN. But what it does have is that Palestine now has the right to be seated among member states in alphabetical order. Palestine has the right to make statements on behalf of a group, to submit proposals and amendments. Palestine has the right to co-sponsor proposals and amendments. It has the right to propose items to be included in the provisional agenda, the right of members of the delegation of the State of Palestine to be elected as officers in the committees of the General Assembly, and also full participation in UN conferences. And this UN news agency report quoted China, whose representative spoke out in this meeting in support of Palestine. And China's representative said that on the Palestine-Israel issue, the United States has repeatedly used its veto in an unjustified attempt to obstruct the international community's efforts to correct the historical injustice long visited on Palestine. And China said that the U.S. abusing its veto power in this way, quote, is not commensurate with the role of a responsible major country. So China is saying that the U.S. is not responsible. And Russia also spoke out in this meeting in support of Palestinian membership. The Russian ambassador said that it is the moral duty of everyone to recognize Palestine. And he said that the resolution was too complicated because it was attempting to advance Palestinian membership as far as possible without provoking another veto from Washington on full membership. So this is the situation we're in. China, Russia, the vast majority of countries on earth support giving full membership to Palestine. It's really only the United States that is standing in the way, abusing its veto power and denying the people of Palestine their sovereignty and their right to a state. So anytime the US government claims that it supposedly supports a two-state solution and peace, you should always remember these votes that the US carried out and ignore what the US says and look at its actions, because words are cheap, actions are what actually matter. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me. Please like and subscribe. I will be back very soon. See you next time.